What is the unrealized? It's the abyss between what could be achieved by creative entrepreneurs and what regulation permits them to aim for. The abyss is deepening.
This is the Economics for Business podcast. We are here to help all businesses become champions for customers and value, improving lives with preferred and innovative products and services. We offer you the knowledge and tools to make your entrepreneurial journey a successful one. Now, here's your host, Hunter Hastings.
Hi, Hunter Hastings here. We're introducing an important idea today. We're introducing it in the form of a problem to solve, and only entrepreneurial businesses can solve it. Hopefully, we can inspire a lot of creativity in addressing it. The idea comes from one of our leading thinkers, Bylund, and it's based on his decades of research and experience in the field of entrepreneurship and the clarity of Austrian economic thinking. His name for the idea is the unrealized. It's a negative space, one that we hope listeners will fill with their positivity. The unrealized is a gap between what is possible and what is realized. We believe what is possible with entrepreneurial creativity is unlimited. That's because the imagination of customers and consumers is unlimited. They never stop searching for betterment. They're always thinking things could be improved. That's an invitation to entrepreneurial businesses to find implementable routes to that improvement. Routes that might not be open today, but can be unlocked in the future via creative thinking and new combinations of capital, new inventions, new services, new lines of code, new metals. What's possible? Whatever entrepreneurs think is possible, or think might be possible. What gets in the way of such possibilities? Well, time is one thing. It took time for IBM to perfect the 2-nanometer semiconductor chip, but now cell phone batteries will last 4 times as long, laptops will run faster, data centers will have lower carbon footprints, and self-driving cars will exhibit faster detection of objects and therefore become safer. All of these things are imaginable, and the entrepreneurs of IBM made them possible. But time is not our greatest barrier. One of the greatest is regulation and legislation, because it puts limits on imagination. It tells entrepreneurs what they mustn't think about doing. For example, Jeff Bezos' visionary Blue Origin company that's imagining a future where millions of people are working in space to benefit Earth must apply for a rudimentary FAA license. Mr. Bezos himself must write public letters to the NASA administrator to demonstrate how to unlock bureaucratic budget constraints and permits in order to introduce the full benefits of free market competition into private space travel. Private space travel has, until recently, been unrealized. To what degree has this been the fault of regulation and unimaginative bureaucratic regulators? How much more could have been achieved by today? How deep of an abyss is the unrealized? How many years of accumulated and compounding under-realization have we suffered? Our original thinking today is from Per Bylund. Regular listeners will know that Per is the recently tenured Record Johnston Professor of Free Enterprise in the School of Entrepreneurship at Oklahoma State University. He's a leading researcher into issues in entrepreneurship, strategic management, and organizational economics. He writes regularly for Entrepreneur Magazine and Entrepreneur.com. He's immersed in both the theory and the practice of entrepreneurship. Per, welcome again to the Economics for Business podcast.
Thanks for having me.
It's always good to have you here. And we're going to talk about the title of a recent book of yours, the content of a recent book of yours. It's called The Seen, the Unseen, and the Unrealized. And the subtitle is How Regulations Affect Our Everyday Lives. And the implication is that we could potentially realize better lives than we do. We could experience more value. Entrepreneurs could deliver more value, which is what they try to do, if there wasn't so much regulation or if regulation didn't exist at all. So that's our content for the day. Let's cover the first part of the title, Per, the seen and the unseen. A lot of people might be familiar with that, but a lot of people might not. So walk us through the economist's view of first-order effects and second- and third-order effects and beyond of what you call market-impacting phenomena.
Right. So the seen and the unseen really goes back to the mid 19th century as core to how to distinguish a good economist from a bad economist. And it's very easy to see what is actually there and nothing else. But the problem with the economy is that everything is really related and everything is integrated. And if you change one thing, that means that you didn't get something else. So it goes back to Frederick Bastiat's essay, which is on the broken window fallacy. And it's a mistake that economists are still making very often. And he tells a story of a baker's son who happens to crash a window, um, and at first people are really upset with him because why did you crash that window, naughty boy, that sort of thing. But then someone always mentions, Bastiat says, that, well, this is actually a good thing because this means more business for the glazer. So the baker has to buy a window from the glazer, and that's a good thing because that means more revenue, and the glazer can potentially expand his business and hire more people and makes more profit, and and the glazer himself will buy more stuff because he has more money. So this causes a whole chain of events that are all positive, right? And that's what you can see, and this is something that we hear a lot from economists with, say, war is a productive thing because it increases economic activity when people need to rebuild their homes and things like that. Destruction really helps us, uh, which is, of course, nonsense because they're not considering the unseen, which is, in Bastiat's example, what would the baker have done with the money had he not had to buy a new window? Well, he would probably have bought a pair of shoes, for instance, or a coat or something like that. So this new business for the glazer is really less business for the shoemaker or whatever he was going to do with that money. And you need to consider both sides and see the full impact of something, not just what you cause, but also what was not caused because of the impact on the economy. So the seen and the unseen, you have to compare the two.
Yeah. And I think Thomas Sowell and Henry Hazlitt referred to that as seeing not just the first order effects, but the second and third order effects. And what they said was politicians and regulators demonstrate a limited ability to understand that, to think through the unseen. Is that because they don't understand markets, or they don't like markets, or they have the wrong incentives? Why can't they see that?
Well, I think it's a little bit of all of those things, probably. And very often, um, they have a policy that they really want to enact, and it's their favorite policy, and it doesn't really matter what the effects are because they don't really affect the politician themselves. So they sell it using rhetoric, and unfortunately, and part of the reason I wrote the book is that we tend to think of regulations in terms of the promises made. So it's the rhetoric for the regulation, not the actual impact. So with the rhetoric, of course, never says that, oh, look at all these things that we didn't get because of the regulation. The rhetoric for selling the policy is always look at what we're promising because of this regulation. So a common example is the minimum wage laws, where, of course, they're sold in using the rhetoric that everybody should earn a lot of money and everybody should have a living wage or these types of value terms. But what it really means is that you cannot pay anyone below a certain level, which means all the jobs below that level, all the jobs that don't create more value, and all the people who might need to learn or accumulate experience and these sort of thing before they can be more productive, they can't get a job because they can't produce that amount of money. And of course, you can't sell that full story. You can't say, well, here's a policy. We're going to raise the bar so that new entrants, young people and other people without skills can't enter the job market, but those on the job market will look like they're making a whole lot more money. You can't really sell a policy using both the seen and the unseen. It's really impossible, and it's a harder argument too to make. But in order to be a good economist, you have to see both sides. You can't just look at one of them.
Yeah. Well, that's a good segue into what might be the third side, which is the unrealized. You say that the danger of those kinds of policy interventions and economic regulations uh, generate this problem of the unrealized. And your book is exemplary in the logic and rigor that you walk through to get there. So I'd like you to share that with us. You start with the entrepreneur investing in production to satisfy customer or consumer wants. They're trying to serve people. Obviously, they're calculating a future gain for themselves. But regulation, when it's added to the marketplace, is a burden on the entrepreneur to produce. So start us there. Take us through that logic, Per.
Right. So I think we need to define regulation first. So we already said that regulation is really sold using the rhetorics. I mean, there's a lot of marketing from politicians to sell, and even usually the regulations are even called things. So the laws are called such things as the Affordable Care Act, and not actually what it entails, but it's what they want people to think when they see the law, and whatever value terms they can use so that people support it. But a regulation is really just a restriction. It's a restriction imposed on people's actions. So politically, they're deciding that you cannot do a certain thing, or you can only do a certain thing if you do it in a certain way. And these types of restrictions mean, of course, that you're limiting what entrepreneurs can do. And entrepreneurs, as we know from previous episodes of the podcast, they're trying to satisfy consumer wants as much as possible. And by doing that, they can get a high price for whatever it is they're producing and offering, which means it's easier for them to cover the cost and therefore earn a profit. So, I mean, there's no contradiction here. They provide, in a sense, a profit for the consumer, and therefore they can earn a profit themselves. But say there is a regulation that affects one entrepreneur, so that entrepreneur can no longer pursue what he or she thinks is the highest value for consumers. So they have to choose the second or the third or what have you, some option, some optional course of some optional action that they wouldn't consider to be the best way to do it. Obviously, we lose something, and obviously this leads to a different type of world because this entrepreneur is not producing as much value for consumers as he or she thought he would be. So something is very lost here. The problem with this, of course, with the realized this, because this is still the unseen. This is all these value creation that we don't get. The unrealized is that the economy is really cumulative. So one innovation builds off of what was already done. So entrepreneurs look around themselves, they see that, oh, look at this new technology. I can apply this in a different way. Or look at this type of product. Well, wait a minute. People are using it in a different way. So maybe I can produce a different product that is better at satisfying this type of want. So they are responding to what they see around them and they're taking this to the next level. Of course, if a regulation then restricts entrepreneurs from producing a certain solution for consumers, that means that the next big thing that builds off of this will also not happen. And this means, of course, that consumers are much worse off. Even if in right now, in the present, the restriction means that entrepreneurs are doing what politicians would rather that they do, it still means in the long run, or after a couple of generations of goods or what have you, that consumers are much worse off.
Yeah, so you use a term in the book, Per, that you've kind of elucidated there called redirecting value. What regulation does is redirect value, and the implication is it directs it to a worse place. So the unrealized is the difference between where the regulation directs entrepreneurs to create value and where they might have gone otherwise. That's the gap. Do I have it right?
Yes, and that the redirection is really a redirection to different value trajectory, you could say, because the economy is cumulative. So one way of thinking about it is think of Henry Ford and his production of the Model T, where he used technologies that already existed, like the assembly line and the automobile. He invented neither of those things, but he combined them, and he realized, well, I can actually use this stuff, and I can produce a standardized automobile, and therefore keep the price so low that most people can afford to buy a car. And therefore he revolutionized basically the world. And suddenly people started driving cars instead of riding horses, and people started gas stations, and there were mechanics popping up a little here and there, and competitors were producing cars, and we got to where we are now. But say that there was a restriction in place where he would not be able to use assembly line production, for instance. So there was a protection for um, car workers, and they needed to produce cars in whatever way they felt like, and whatever way they considered to be the best way. That would mean that we would never get to where we're at now. Many of the innovations that happened much after Henry Ford, perhaps, they would not happen, because we would be on a different trajectory. We would be producing cars the way they had been produced up to that point, and then whatever would happen after, we simply wouldn't happen. And we would get innovations based off of what Henry Ford did instead, which would necessarily be lower, because he would not choose that unless he was forced to by the restriction that was imposed on him, right? So he would see different ways of doing things, and he would pick the lesser of the two, because he was not allowed to do the better way. And of course, then you would have other innovations follow on what he did, not what he wanted to do.
Yeah, you can use the Uber example for that, I think, in historical terms. We were directed or forced to ride in those ugly yellow cabs with the medallions that were all broken down. They had 200,000 miles on the clock, and the seat springs were broken, and you couldn't develop a relationship with the driver, and you didn't feel safe. But that was the only choice. And then when that was broken, now Uber comes along, and you get your choice of what kind of car, and you can talk to the driver in a different way, and the software gets better every time and keeps getting updated. So there was this big pool of unrealized that we suddenly got to dive into, and then it got better and better and better. So that's another example, I think.
Yeah, and it's a good one. I mean, because it's in the present to begin with, and we have not yet seen where this will lead. Because this innovation itself, it was very successful, sure. So it created value, but it also opened for this new type of sharing economy that we had not seen before, and this type of thinking that Uber realized, that was made possible by Uber. This type of matchmaking between resource owners and those who were in need of the resources, it was facilitated by Uber in many different types of industries. And of course, that's changing the whole structure of the economy. And people are able to use their smartphones in a different way because of this new technology that proved to be very effective and very well liked. And now people understand it too. So it's much easier for entrepreneurs to build off of that experience of Uber's and produce something completely new.
Yep. Are you including all kinds of regulations here, Per? We've talked about restrictions. You mentioned prohibitions. You got to ride the yellow cab. That's kind of a prohibition. But also there are subsidies, and you mentioned the minimum wage. Are we counting all kinds of regulations in this restriction of value?
Yes, absolutely. So any imposition on the market, and really a restriction of how entrepreneurs may act, would be the type of regulation that I'm talking about. I mean, it has to be imposed on them, because if they make it a choice, it's just a choice. And of course, they're trying to produce whatever value that the best value that they can. But if they're restricted from pursuing that value, then of course something else happens. We get to an alternative world, and then as things continue and other people build off of this alternative world that they created, then we're going to get into a very different place, perhaps. And we're no longer really pursuing what is benefiting consumers most because of this. Let's say there are no restrictions whatsoever, and we impose one. Well, to the degree that that affects an entrepreneur, that entrepreneur is going to pursue a different path than what he or she would have pursued otherwise. And other entrepreneurs will follow suit on this different path. So it will create, in a sense, a very different economy. The structure of the whole economy, all the productions that happen will be very different. So the world will be different. And all of this are built off of the lower trajectory that this entrepreneur was forced onto, in a sense, because of this restriction.
Yeah. that's so important a point, that it's cumulative and it's compounding, and it gets worse and worse. It started a long time ago, and it's going to continue. So the amount of unrealized, if that's a good expression, is just piling up and piling up and piling up because of regulation. That's a scary thought. But someone's getting more value out of this pair, and you say it's the regulator, right? They create value for themselves. How do you think of their incentives? Is that public choice theory, or is that pair thinking about people?
Well, it's public choice theory to some extent. I mean, you have this the whole political apparatus. They can benefit themselves through using regulations, and they can benefit their friends, and they can benefit whoever gave them the greatest campaign donations and things like that. Of course, there are those things, but there are also restrictions that do not really have. It's not really part of a profit agenda. So it might be simply that they want to, say, protect the environment, or they want to liberate women, or what have you. All of those things. They want to force a different behavior onto people, and I'm not really arguing in the book against regulations. I mean, I'm just arguing that in order to be able to at all analyze regulations, we have to look at the actual cost of regulations. And the problem so far is that not only have we overlooked the unseen, which is the immediate cost, we've also overlooked the long-term cost of forcing entrepreneurs onto this lower path, this lower trajectory, right? So we, like you mentioned, this has been going on for hundreds of years, with all these creations of value that did not happen, and then everything has followed suit, and it has compounded on top of these lesser choices that people have been forced to make, basically, and we have to consider the full cost in order to make an informed decision. And right now, we are making a decision for a new regulation, a new restriction based on only the seen, and adding the unseen. That's what economists typically do. They look at, what would have happened otherwise, and what is the alternative right now. I think that is still only covering a fraction of the real cost, because entrepreneurship builds off of other entrepreneurship and builds off of the successful ideas and the value that was actually created. So the unrealized has to be part of the picture too.
A quick note. Did you know that we provide supplemental materials for each podcast? Listening to and understanding the key takeaways from our expert guests helps you think better about building a more beautiful business. Taking direct action and implementing these strategies is when the real work begins. Take a concrete, immediate step to implementing a better business model today by downloading the show notes and business tool we've created for this episode. Visit Mises.org/E4Bpod. That's MISES.org/E, the number 4, the letter B, POD, and click on today's episode. Now, back to our interview.
Yeah, in my head now, I'm seeing this horrible pileup of regulation upon regulation upon regulation. The government gets bigger and bigger and bigger, creates more value for itself, or the regulators create more value for themselves. And our unrealized value as consumers is compounding in the same way. And so the gap is increasing. I mean, that's more than the unseen. As you say, it's an important new idea, the unrealized. It's cumulative unrealized. It's an awful thought. But the regulators say, hey, we're improving the market. There's market failures. And you say, boy, they get that all wrong. Why is that?
Yeah, it's the simple answer to that is that a market failure is really that the real market, the real economy did not fit with exactly what the model predicted.
Mm-hmm.
And the model that is usually used and that is also taught in introductory courses in economics at universities is really the perfect competition model, where everything is known, and And we know everything about the present and the future. We know everything about people's preferences. We know everything about people's behavior. And then all we need is just produce. By a billion companies are producing exactly the same things, and consumers are just buying exactly the same things from those producers. So we have a general equilibrium situation. But there's no movement in general equilibrium. Nothing is really going on. It really has nothing at all to do with the real economy. Because in the real economy, you have entrepreneurs figuring out new things to do, new ways to do things, and completely different ways of satisfying consumers. And very often they think of things that would satisfy consumers in ways that consumers themselves don't understand until it happens. So they very often, you have entrepreneurs disrupting the whole economy, changing the way it works, changing the possibilities available. None of this really fits the model, and all of this is um, really an important function or an important feature of the market too. So uh, Schumpeter, the great economist, talked about how a system that is never maximized is much more creates much more value than a system that is always maximized, which is something I mentioned to my students, and because it seems a little bit paradoxical, but what it means is that unless you have slack resources in the economy, unless you have opportunities that people can exploit, uh, unless you have entrepreneurs innovating new things, you can't really have anything take off. So if at any moment you're using everything to their fullest, given whatever we know at that moment, you can't really create anything new. So because we have a system that is an unfinished process, that because we have a market that is always recreating itself in a sense and creating new goods and services and figuring new stuff out, um, it's sort of taking off, and we're producing the prosperity that we will have tomorrow.
Yeah, and this idea of a dynamic economy, a constantly changing structure of production is as you say, not one that the regulators can put up with. I hadn't thought about what they're seeking as static equilibrium or perfect markets, right? They're trying to restrict and distort and limit choices, you say, and make some choices unmakeable. So that if a consumer wants to choose one of those new innovations that the entrepreneurs are producing, sometimes the regulators say, no, you can't make that choice. You can't ride in that Uber. You can't have that new experimental drug. You can't have the flying car.
Yeah, because imagine if you want to plan a system and the system itself is reinventing itself. It's almost impossible to plan that type of system. And the economy, of course, works that way. The market economy is reinventing itself. The market economy is full of innovations, and entrepreneurs are trying stuff in every direction all the time, pretty much. And they're trying sometimes outrageous things, and outrageous things that turn out to be really valuable because people really like the outcome of those outrageous things. But if you want to plan the whole thing, you really need to put an end to, in a sense, free will and to people's creative thinking. Because as long as people think outside the box, it, all plans are really out the window.
Well, let's. I just want to focus on a couple of words that you've used, and you can put them in a sentence. You talk about generating greater optionality for consumers. So the word generating and generative, that's one that we try to adopt, that this economy, if left to itself, will dynamically generate all kinds of new ideas, and that'll give new value options to consumers. So generativity is something that the regulator's trying to strangle and we're trying to encourage. And then on the other side of that is optionality for consumers, that they have more options. Just pause for a couple of seconds on the idea of generative and the idea of consumer optionality.
Well, they're really closely connected, of course.
Mhm.
And optionality means really the number of different valuable choices or alternatives that you have in any situation. Um, and the market is really good at figuring out, or the entrepreneurs in the market are really good at figuring out how to satisfy consumers on consumers' own terms. I mean, that's what entrepreneurs do, and we've talked about that a number of times on this podcast. How entrepreneurs are really trying to figure out how to meet people's wants and needs in a future, and they try to bring that about. And if you have a number of or a multitude of entrepreneurs trying to do that all the time, the result will be a lot of different attempts, a lot of different types of goods and services and solutions to problems that are offered to consumers and offered to more and more consumers as well. So optionality is simply having that situation where you can choose to do so many different things for your hard-earned cash, that you can satisfy so many different wants and satisfy your wants in so many different ways. Whereas if you compare to a fully planned society, then usually the plan will be to produce food, and then you have maybe a couple of kinds of food, but that's it. So it's in a sense it's Soviet Union type economy, right, where you don't have a choice between all types of beef, say, that we have in stores today. Even though it's a highly regulated economy, you can still choose between corn-fed beef and grass-fed beef and different types of cuts, and you can have it ground, or you can have a piece of steak, or you can have different sizes and thicknesses and all these different things. Or you can go to a butcher and you can ask them to cut whatever you like. Whereas that's hardly the case in a much more regulated economy. So there you would not have that optionality, which means you cannot personally satisfy your wants to the same extent. So you do not get as much value. So the optionality is, I think it's really very important. It's core to understanding our well-being and our prosperity as a society, because the more optionality you have, the more different choices or alternatives you have in a situation, the better you can target your actual want in that situation. And of course, those alternatives have to be created by entrepreneurs who imagine that they've found like a niche where they can produce something that no one else has probably thought of, but they think this is really valuable to some consumers. So they will create this option for consumers and make it available to them, and then hope, of course, that consumers will choose whatever it is that they produce. So entrepreneurs are in the business of generating this optionality situation, creating all these choices that can be made, all these alternatives that are presented to the consumer. So because we have a fairly free market economy, we have all these choices that we can make, and we can pursue different types of lives as consumers, for the simple reason that entrepreneurs are trying to have been trying to and have produced the different alternatives for us to satisfy our wants and lead our lives in the way that we see fit.
So you say, Per, that the way that we should look at this is through a lens that you say is what otherwise would have been. I were trying to think about this unrealized, and it's a would have been. It's not an is. So you can't measure it in the progressive aggregates like GDP. Perhaps it's more of a feeling than it is a measurement. But how do you think people? How can we change people to be thinking about what otherwise would have been and finding the restrictions and throwing them off?
Yeah, I wish I knew. I mean, talking about what never happened and what isn't, it could be pretty much anything.
One of the directions towards realizing more of the unrealized is more entrepreneurship. That the entrepreneur on the supply side is always thinking about that, always thinking about new possibilities, always thinking about giving more optionality to the customer. So if we taught more entrepreneurship, if we taught more that the politicians are robbing people of the optionality that entrepreneurs would otherwise give them, if more and more people thought entrepreneurially, we could solve that from the supply side, and the demand would follow. Is that one way to think?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, we would always, as consumers, it's pretty obvious that in any situation we're in, we try to do as best as we can with whatever funds we have, and we try to satisfy our wants to the degree possible. And of course, the more options we have, the more chances we have of satisfying our wants, the better it is too. So I don't think anybody is really against uh, having those options, because we are also all not the same. We want to satisfy different wants and in different ways. What people are against might be the waste that they perceive in the system, and that's typically based in uh, the illusion that they know what people should want, whereas the economy is not really involved in sort of figuring out what people should want, because any entrepreneur will know and will tell you that they can try to produce what they think people should want. That's a great way of losing money and losing your investment.
Mhm.
What they should do is produce what is actually going to be of value to consumers, and the consumers understand to be of value as well. So those are two different types of mindset. I think one is providing people with the means to lead better lives, which is really what entrepreneurs are and should be doing. They're serving consumers, and that's their job. And the other is really a sort of planner's mentality, where they're trying to correct and adjust and perfect society. And of course, what they're doing is really just applying their own preferences and thinking that people should follow their preferences. And that is, it is always to some extent authoritarian, because you're saying that whatever you think is better should be better for everybody, or people should lead their lives in this way. And the market is much more egalitarian in that sense, because the market doesn't really distinguish between people in that sense. It doesn't really raise some people above others, because a consumer is a consumer. There's nothing more to it. So anyone can choose whatever they like, and if people want to choose different things, that just means that there are opportunities for entrepreneurs to produce other things and profit themselves.
So let me push uh, an idea that I have, and please tell me if it's wrong, about Austrian economics and entrepreneurship on the supply side, supplying uh, more of what can close the gap on the unrealized. So the entrepreneurial calculation in entrepreneurship, from an Austrian point of view, isn't entirely mathematical. You're not constantly dialing up the risk adjustment factor to make the numbers harder and limiting possibilities. Austrian economists or Austrian entrepreneurs include subjective values. Their goals might be different than numbers. They include fulfillment and meaning and achievement and those kinds of things. They have missions that they want to accomplish. And so they make it possible to realize more, that they can give the customers more options than they currently have. Is that a valid thought, that the Austrian approach has more potential to realize more and therefore there's less unrealized?
Yeah, absolutely. I think so. I mean, Austrian entrepreneurs are really involved in sort of a value calculus and not a money calculus. I mean,
Mhm.
money is very helpful in figuring out whether you're covering your costs, and it's helpful in on sort of the social level. But in order to place a sale, in order to produce something that is actually uh, worth something for the consumer, you have to think of the value. And the value, as we know, it doesn't really have there's no way of measuring value. It's just satisfaction itself. And for the Austrian entrepreneur, they would try to figure out, how do I serve consumers best on consumers' own terms, which is the value to them, and then can they would they be willing to pay enough so that it's worth it to me, which is another value calculus. And of course, can I keep the costs below the price? But it's really value that is primary in all of these things. Will this that I want to produce and that I think I can produce, will this be of sufficient value for people when I offer it to them?
Yeah, so I think we've got to learn or teach ourselves the language to communicate that kind of thing. For example, we talk about an unhampered market, and that's a valid thought. It might not mean a lot to a lot of people, but if we can get them imagining what would be possible, that they should demand what is currently unrealized, that more optionality is in their future if we go this entrepreneurial route, maybe we can find better ways to communicate.
Yeah, absolutely. I think so. I mean, it's also important to realize, I think, no pun intended, but to realize that the unrealized is not really any type of Jetsons future, because it's not the case that we could be exactly anywhere, but it is what we lost because of those restrictions. So it's distinct from, we talked about the perfectly competitive model before with general equilibrium where all knowledge is known to everyone. And that's sort of a made up fictitious view of the world, which is not really this world. But the unrealized is intended really to make us focus on what we lost in the real world. It's what would have been had we not restricted entrepreneurs in their production efforts. So whether this includes treating or curing cancer or having flying cars or whatever we might have had, it's impossible to tell. But it's not necessarily eternal life and living on planets light years away. Well, I guess it could be, but it is an actual real alternative that would have been without these restrictions.
Yeah, if we were mathematicians, we'd say they'd reduced the range of probabilities, but we're not, so we call it the unrealized. So, Per, thank you. Your book's a tremendous contribution. It certainly got me thinking. I can't get out of my head this image of the piling up of regulations and limitations on one side and the constantly accumulating unrealized on the other, and what we could have had if this was different 100 years ago or 50 years ago or even a year ago. So you'll leave us with that picture.
Thank you.
Economics for Business is a production of the Mises Institute. To explore more content like this, visit Mises.org. And for more from Hunter Hastings, visit hunterhastings.com.